It really is great to see so many of you here, and especially to see so many young people in the congregation. And as you know, tonight we've come to the second in our short series of services having to do with love and marriage. And next Sunday evening we're going to be talking about being happy at home. And we'll mention some of the things that in our experience and in the experience of others give us a kind of prescription for a deep and satisfying home life. So do come again next Sunday evening. But tonight, as you know, the subject is without benefit of clergy. And you probably know that I've a prejudice against this right at the beginning, because for one thing, it's very bad for business. But we know that there are many young people in our society and in our community who are living together, as we say, common law or without benefit of clergy. There are people who worship here regularly who are living like that. Some of you may be doing that yourselves. And I want us to begin by noticing that some young people who decide to live together, common law, care very deeply for each other. They are committed to each other, and they accept responsibility for each other and for their actions and for the outcome and issue of their actions. Indeed, sometimes when they talk to me, they say, we love each other so deeply already, we're so totally committed, and we accept responsibility and so on and so on, that really we don't see any need to be married. I mean, we've got it all already. Now, you see, I go a rather different way on that one. What I say to them is, but if you are so deeply in love with each other, and if you are so completely committed, and if in fact you do accept responsibility for each other, I mean, why shouldn't you be married? That's what marriage really is. As I said to you last Sunday evening, it's not something that's imposed on reluctant lovers. It is another way of loving which lovers discover. Because one of the ways of loving is not only to care for somebody else and to be responsible for them and to accept responsibility for the relationship, but to declare that this is so to society. To say this is the way it is. So that marriage, again, as I said last Sunday evening, is not a matter of pieces of paper or rings on the finger merely. It's another way of loving. I think it's the best way to love somebody whom we love. I love the story of the young fellow who wanted his girlfriend to sleep with him, and she wouldn't do it. And he said to her in a rather huffy sort of tone, oh, well, you don't love me. And she said, now don't be silly. Of course I love you. I love you so much, I'm even prepared to marry you. Well, now, what greater test of love could you have than that? I mean, she's even prepared to marry her. Well, you see, I'm entirely with her. I think, as the poet says, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. One of the ways in which I love my wife is that she is my wife, and that we're married, and that we're committed to each other and have acknowledged that before other people. Now, very often, people who live common law for a while do get married. I marry them. So does Francis and Reed and Morley. We all do. And let me tell you right now that some of the most touching and some of the most moving wedding services that we conduct are of young people who decided to live together without benefit of clergy and then realized that it just wasn't enough for them. Having loved each other so profoundly and so deeply, they came to see this is not enough for us. We must commit ourselves to each other in a service of Christian worship, and so they come to us and say, we would like you to marry us. So don't misunderstand ministers, or at least some ministers. When they hold out for the the joy and wonder of that. It's not because we're a bunch of legalists. I don't know why anybody thinks that. It's because we are so incurably romantic that we want people to get married. Because I believe it is the most secure, the most serene, and the best way in which two people can love each other. Now you see, sometimes the church has rather looked down their nose at such people and lifted up their hands in, well, they would say holy, sometimes I would rather say in unholy horror at what goes on. And they divorce themselves from it. They push it away. And they condemn those wicked and irresponsible young people. And sometimes they're not wicked, and sometimes they're not irresponsible. And when church people do that, the offensive thing about it is that they overlook their complicity in what is going on. Now, when I believe so profoundly in marriage, it's very easy for me to believe that. Do you know why? Because I was brought up in a happy home. Because the fundamental reality of my life as I was growing up was not simply that my parents loved me, although that was true beyond any shadow of doubt or any question. But the deepest security of my life was not even that they loved me, it was that they loved each other. And in their love for each other, I found my security. And now they're both over 80 years old, and they're more in love than they've ever been at any time in their life. Now, it's easy for me to believe in marriage coming from that kind of experience. But there are all sorts of young people, and their experience hasn't been like that at all. So many of them have seen their parents separate or obtain a divorce, and they've been caught up in all the animosity and hostility and bitterness that goes with that. Sometimes that's been nearly as bad as the bitterness that was there when their parents were married, when there was no peace, and when they stayed together for the sake of the children, and it might well be that they should not have done that because it wasn't for the children's sake, it was to their hurt. I remember one psychologist for whom I have a very great respect talking to a young woman who had a nervous breakdown, full of stress and tension. And as he talked to her, he discovered that so much of this went back to tension in the home. And so he asked her about it. She said, they haven't talked to each other for 5 years. They leave wee notes for each other on the mantelpiece. It all happened because one evening he was silly enough to bring home to dinner somebody whom she didn't like. Now, if that were my experience of marriage, I wouldn't be in any great hurry to rush into it either. And sometimes those of us who feel so superior to young people and look down our nose at them with a kind of holier-than-thou attitude, forget that. And we ought not to forget it. We should realize our complicity in this. Maybe if we had showed them happier marriages with more love and deeper commitment and greater understanding, they wouldn't be so reluctant to get into it themselves. But we've got to go a bit beyond that. And we've got to notice that there are some people who live together, deeply committed and very much loving each other, but that there are others who live together much more casually than that. They are not deeply committed, though they may be greatly attracted to each other. There is no accepting of responsibility for each other and for their actions. Often the relationship is a selfish one, in which each one gets from the other as much as they can get. Now, I think that's a pretty good description of hell, don't you? A society in which everybody tries to get out of everybody else as much as they possibly can. And there's some relationships that are like that. Somebody said once that when a young man says to a young woman, I love you, sometimes what he really means is, I love me and I want you. C.S. Lewis years ago pointed out that sometimes when a man says, I want a woman is the last thing he wants. Not a woman with all her beauty and wonder and complexity. Not love with all the richness of relationships, but just a body that he can use for his own pleasure. Sometimes there is very little love and very little cherishing with those who decide to live together without the benefit of clergy. It's sex, not love. Now, it's my experience from the people who have come to see me that in this kind of relationship it is the girl who suffers more. This kind of casual arrangement is usually more destructive for her than it is for him. Time and time again, it's the girl who has come to see me afterwards and said, I feel as though I've just been exploited, as though I've just been used. I feel dirty when I think about it. And sometimes when that kind of relationship has resulted in an unwanted pregnancy, the girl has come to me, and I'll never forget the sense of sadness and pain with which these words were said. When he discovered that I was pregnant, all he wanted to do was to get rid of me. He just wanted to get me off his hands. Now, I wouldn't like anybody to treat my daughter like that. Would you want anybody to treat your daughter like that? It is my experience that indeed, it is my experience that in sex, generally as they talk to me, that the girl seems to give more, is more emotionally involved in the relationship, and can't walk away from it quite as easily as the fella does. And that generally speaking, women are more profoundly committed to the total relationship than men are, who so easily take sex without love and seem sometimes more easily and readily to walk away from it. Now let me go a wee bit further than that, because I believe that in a society where promiscuity is not uncommon, when there is unfaithfulness in marriage, when that's not unusual, let me tell you that I believe that in that kind of society, women are the greater losers. Thank God that Doris Anderson, who used to be the editor of Chatelaine, has seen this and has said it recently about the latest developments in divorce. She sees this far more threatening to women, who more frequently than not are the victims. And I believe the same thing to be true about abortion. Sometimes women have been saying, and especially feminists have been saying, that the right to abortion gives women more freedom. And so they will talk about freedom of choice. And they see this as part of their emancipation. Let me tell you this, that in a promiscuous society where people are unfaithful also to their marriage vows, easy abortion becomes not a matter of freedom for women, but almost a necessity. It follows from the other things. They all belong together. And I wish some feminists would waken up to this fact, that it's all part of the same process that sees women not as people but as things, as mere sex objects to be used. And that's why it's not at all surprising to me, though it may be surprising to you, that a great deal of the money for the pro-abortion movement, not in Canada but in the United States of America, that a great deal of that money came from, would you ever guess it, from Hugh Hefner and the Playboy Enterprise. Now that seems to me to be perfectly logical. It follows from everything else that views women merely as sex objects. And that's why I say to you again, I say especially to you girls, in all these relationships, it is my perception and my experience that it's the girl who suffers most and is most seriously hurt. Now I want to go a bit further. I want you to notice the difference between sex on television and in the movies and what happens in real life. Now, this seems to me to be desperately important, because it seems to me also that I hardly ever look at a movie or watch a show on television, but that the main protagonists shake hands with each other, and almost before they know each other's names, they're in bed together. And it looks very easy and simple. And what I want to say to you is that it really isn't like that in life. I can turn on the television, and any night, I mean, if I go home this evening, I can do it. I can see violence, I can see people being shot, I can see people being beaten up. Usually you can find at least one rape on a busy evening. I can find all of these things. And then in the intervals, during the commercials, I can go off to the fridge and get myself a sandwich. I mean, it hardly bothers me at all. They're not real people. I mean, it hardly affects me. But let me tell you that a couple of years ago I was in Victoria Hospital here in London, and I stepped onto the elevator. And then there stepped onto the elevator a plainclothes policeman. And he was handcuffed to a young man whom he had just arrested. And not till the day I die will I ever forget the hunted, wistful, hurt look in this young man's eyes. It was a painful, haunting experience. Nobody got beaten up, nobody got shot, nobody got raped. Just to see this young man with handcuffs on was about as much as anybody could stand. I mean, have you ever seen it? And that just brought home to me with unusual power the difference between the kind of thing that you see on television and what really happens in life. You see, if it is as easy, if sex is as easy as it appears on television, I mean, if they just have it without any care for each other, then it's just animal behavior. I mean, sex without love and commitment is just what the animals do. In other words, it's less than human. But if there is commitment, if there is caring, if there is love, then we've got to realize that the relationship is not as simple as TV makes it look, and it can't be as casual as that. Because if there is some love and commitment, somebody's going to get hurt. And I see this, and so do the other ministers of this church, and so do the social council, and all the rest of it. We just see it so. And I said to you last week, it's great to hear these people talk about their satellite relationships, but my, when they come down to earth, somebody's heart is broken. And some wife or some husband discovers that life will not be the same again. And what had been a good relationship becomes a relationship of hurt. And here's another thing I want you to notice. That when the kind of thing that we see on television, when we do it and it is discovered, while it may appear that it's very easy and that society winks at that kind of behavior, when it seems not only that television represents what society does, but in fact thrusts at us another lifestyle which it seems to encourage in us of casual sexual relations. Let me say that when what looks so casual is discovered, then we discover again that it's not as easy as it seems. Because again, the society that seems to wink at it with one side of its face frowns at the consequences of it. And what seems so easy and casual becomes very seriously indeed. Now, I don't need to dwell on this, but I can easily make the point. Not long ago, one of Margaret Thatcher's protégés, I mean, somebody whom she was grooming for an important position in government, someone whom they thought would one day be the Prime Minister of Britain, was found to have an illicit sexual relationship with his secretary. I mean, the world is full of it. You see it on television, read it in the papers, all that. But he's through. Politically, he's finished. And then there was another Canadian MP, wasn't there, out west, who was found with a prostitute. Mind you, he had a very plausible explanation. He said he was conducting a one-man investigation of prostitution. Who is to doubt it? But again, what seems so easy, suddenly this man is politically and socially finished. You think of his family. My God, I mean, how do you look at your children? And when they look at you, how do you see when something like... You see, all I'm saying, I don't want to hammer this, because you see it yourself. It's not quite as simple as it looks. And I'll tell you something else that you may not suspect, but I know this. It's not just society, I mean, like ministers and churches who may frown on this kind of thing. It's your own peers. You university kids, remember this? It's your own peers. Sometimes they're not all that sympathetic when people are discovered and perhaps there is an unwanted pregnancy or something of the sort. Which brings me to the main thing I want to tell you. So you may think that some of the things I've already said are pretty main, but that brings me to the main thing that I want to say to you this evening. And really it's very simple. It is that the decision to be sexually active, as they say, the decision either to do that or not to do it is yours. I think we ought to realize that, and that nobody can stop you doing what you want to do if you want to do it. Nobody can stop you. The decision is yours. But if you decide that that's what you're going to do, then I think you ought to realize a couple of things. I think, as I said last week, so I won't really make very much of it this evening, I think, for one thing, that can violate the integrity of the relationship. I think that human relationships go forward on all fronts together: mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical. And that when the physical gets a bit ahead of everything else, then the relationship is out of joint. I believe, and the church teaches, that the best way to love people is to marry them. Now, I've said that. Is that clear enough? But I want to go on and say something else. And it's simply this: that if you decide to be sexually active by living together without benefit of clergy or in some other way, then for goodness sake, consider the consequences. And whatever you do, don't become pregnant. If you do become pregnant, you will be faced with some of the most difficult, demanding, and painful decisions you will ever have to make at a time when you are ill-equipped by inexperience and by emotional distress to make those decisions. And will you please notice, I'm not preaching at you. I'm simply telling you what I have discovered in my own experience as people have come and talked to me about it. Let me tell you what some of these decisions that you have to make are, and then we'll finish. First of all, you'll have to decide whether or not you're going to have an abortion. Now, our society has trivialized abortion. Do you know that last year in the United States of America there were 1.5 million abortions? And last year in Canada there were 66,000 abortions. Now, as I say, that has trivialized it. It might seem then that abortion is an easy matter. But you see, in my experience, it isn't an easy matter, because it isn't easy for some of the people who come to talk to me. There is an enormous pressure to have an abortion, because it seems with one simple single act to solve all the difficulties, and you're back where you started again. Except that it leaves this out of the accounting, that some young people who are good and sensitive and loving young people are not at all sure that abortion is a trivial matter. Sometimes they think it really is wrong, that it is evil. Sometimes they're not sure. But they know it isn't trivial. And then they're put in a position of having to make a very serious moral decision that they have to live with for the rest of their life, and they do it under an enormous pressure of time. And that's no way to make that kind of decision. Sometimes those who come to see me feel that they can't have an abortion, whatever their friends say, that to do so would be killing a human life, and that the decision is a dreadful one for them. And let me tell you this, that sometimes people come to see me, and I hope this isn't terribly hurtful for some here, but it has to be said. Sometimes people come to talk to me who in years past did have an abortion, and it distresses them still. And you see, it's the good and the loving and the sensitive ones who suffer most in that kind of decision. Now, if the girl decides to carry the child and to bring the child to birth, that often means a radical replanning of her life. Sometimes those who come to see me and talk about this are high achievers. Sometimes they're doing graduate, sometimes they've planned courses in other countries. And if they decide to keep or to have the baby, to allow the pregnancy to come to full term and to have the child, that means a radical reordering of their life. And that can be very difficult. All this is difficult and disappointing and painful to the self and to parents and relatives and friends. And again, let me say that the society which seems to wink at our sexual activity sometimes now expresses its disapproval of the consequences of it, and that comes home to us and to our parents and to our friends. And again, let me say that it's the good and the decent and the sensitive who suffer most. Now, sometimes I've known girls who have carried this off marvelously. They've made their decision to have their child, and they have reordered their life, and they've done it with dignity and with integrity, and they have achieved a new maturity in the experience that they've gone through. But it's been very powerful, and it has been extremely painful and difficult. Another painful decision that the girl must make if she gives birth to the child is whether or not she will keep him, and that's not an easy one. It used to be just a few years ago that all the mother had to do was to say, look at the child and say, yes, that's my child, and then the child would be given up to adoption. But it's not like that anymore. Now they encourage the mother to get to know her little boy or her little girl, and to really realize then what it is she's doing if she gives her child up for adoption. And some can't do it. They just can't do it. They decide to keep their child. It's not easy, but some of them have done it splendidly. Again, we have people in our congregation who are in this situation, and they've done marvelously. They've brought up their little one as a single parent, and again they've done it with grace and with dignity and with a sense of integrity. But again, it hasn't been easy. And others decide differently. They believe that the very best thing that they can do for their little one is not to keep him or her, but to give their child up for adoption, feeling that what their infant needs more than anything else is the home with the security of a father and mother who care for each other. And they make that act of surrender with enormous selflessness and with great courage, and sometimes it is heartbreaking to see what it is they go through. I think of one particular girl who knew her social worker very well, and her little baby was born on Christmas Day, and she said to her social worker just before the baby was born, "This is a special day, isn't it?" And her wee one was born, and she suckled him at her breast, and then at last she gave him into other loving hands to be adopted. And I marvel at the courage of that. Can you imagine the pain and the anguish? Let me say this to some of you who were adopted, and you know the love of the people who received you. let me say, don't discount the love of the people who gave you up, because sometimes they surrendered you only because they loved you so deeply. And I talked to some members of our church who have 2 adopted children, and they said what we'd want to say would be just to express our love and our appreciation to those mothers who had the selflessness and the courage to do that, and I praise them too. But oh, the enormous cost. Now I've really finished. You see what I've done? I've just tried to talk to you as clearly and as frankly as I can out of my own experience of what some of these decisions mean that you have to make. The decision whether you're going to live together, what kind of sexual relationships you're going to have, and some of the implications of them. Can I just close by saying a couple of things to parents? And here is the first. Will you, for goodness sake, know? Will you let your children know that you love them? And that you love them unconditionally? And that you don't love them just when they do things to please you, but even when they do things that are hurtful to you. Sometimes our children think that we love them so much that they couldn't bear to tell us, for example, that they have become pregnant. Let them know beyond any doubt that you love them way beyond that. That more than anything else, what you want them to do is to put their trust and to believe in you. I'll never forget in my own study a young girl who had become pregnant and who said to me, she couldn't bring herself to tell her father, and she said to me, if you were my father, what would you want me to do? What would you want to do? And I said to her, because it was the truth of my soul, I would want you to tell me, and more than anything else in the world, I just want to put my arms around you and love you. Now that's the first thing to parents. Here is the second thing. For goodness sake, talk to them about the things we're talking about this evening. If your young people are here, part of the usefulness of this sermon was simply to make it easier for you to talk to them about these things. And here's the last thing, and I really have finished with this. For goodness sake, be to your young people a symbol of hope, not of condemnation. Do you know one of the things that irks me more than anything else about being a minister of the gospel? It is that before anybody knows me at all, they expect me to judge them. And so many of them just see me, because I'm a minister, as a symbol of condemnation. Do you know what it means to be creative? It means that you bring the best out of the worst. It means that you don't give up. It means that you don't have one plan, so that if that plan is frustrated, everything is lost. That's simply not true. To love creatively means that you bring good out of evil, and out of the strange mixture of our lives to achieve a unique good. So be a symbol of hope to your young people. And remember this, we all live by grace. One of the great words of Reinhold Niebuhr was simply this. He said, in the eyes of God, the difference between a good man and a bad man is insignificant, and that's true. Do you know why? Because we all live by grace. Because He loves us, not because we're good, but because He loves us. Not because we've done anything to deserve it, but because He loves us. Not because we're perfect, but because He loves us. Not because we're acceptable, but because we're accepted. That's it. And that's your dignity. And that's your worth. So remember who you are. You are His child. Infinitely precious. Unique, unrepeatable, and that's your dignity and your grace.